The evening lights of the city were just beginning to glow when the doors of the elegant restaurant opened for another busy night. Outside, luxury cars slowly pulled up to the entrance, one after another. Well-dressed guests stepped out, adjusting their coats and dresses before walking inside. The place was known for its quiet luxury, soft music, and perfectly prepared food. Many people came there not only to eat but to feel important for a few hours. Inside the restaurant, the staff moved quickly but quietly. Plates were placed carefully on tables, glasses were polished until they shined, and candles were lit to create a warm atmosphere. Every detail mattered in a place like this. Among the waitresses working that night was a young woman who had been there for almost 2 years. She moved through the room with calm steps, carrying trays and greeting guests with a polite smile. Most people who saw her would think she was just another hardworking waitress trying to get through a long shift. She never complained about the job, even when the nights were busy and the customers demanding. She simply focused on her work, making sure every table had what it needed. Some guests noticed her kindness and thanked her. Others barely looked at her at all. That was how things usually were. But what most people in that restaurant did not know was that she had once lived a very different life. Long before she began serving food and drinks, music had been the center of her world. When she was a child, her home had been small and simple, but it always felt warm because of one special thing in the living room: an old upright piano. The piano had belonged to her father. It was not new or expensive, and a few keys were slightly worn, but to her it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Every evening after school, she would sit on the bench while her father stood beside her, gently guiding her hands across the keys. At first she learned the basics, slowly pressing one note after another. But as time passed, she began to understand the music more deeply. Her father never forced her to practice. Instead, he made every lesson feel like a small adventure. Sometimes he would ask her to close her eyes and imagine a story while she played. Other times he would challenge her to play a melody in a softer way or with more feeling. Those moments shaped her childhood. Soon the simple lessons turned into serious practice. She would spend hours at the piano, repeating difficult parts until they sounded just right. The neighbors often heard music coming through the windows of the small house. Some evenings it was gentle and calm. Other times it was strong and powerful. Her father always listened with quiet pride. By the time she became a teenager, people around her started noticing something special in her playing. Teachers at school encouraged her to perform during small events. Each performance made her more confident. She dreamed about studying music professionally one day. She imagined playing in concert halls, traveling to new places, and sharing her music with people she had never met. For a long time, that dream felt possible. But life does not always follow the plans people make. One year, everything changed suddenly. Her father became seriously ill, and the peaceful rhythm of their home was replaced with hospital visits and worry. Medical bills quickly began to pile up, and the small savings the family had disappeared faster than anyone expected. During those difficult months, the piano in the living room stayed silent most of the time. She still loved music, but it became harder to focus on practice when so many other things were happening. Her father tried to stay positive, often telling her not to give up on her dream. Even when he felt weak, he would sometimes ask her to play a simple melody so he could listen. Those were quiet moments filled with emotion. Eventually, the illness took him away. After that, nothing felt the same. Without her father's support, the dream of studying music started slipping away. The family needed money just to keep their home and take care of daily expenses. Continuing her education in music became impossible. So she made a difficult decision. Instead of applying to a music program, she began looking for work. At first, it was only meant to be temporary. She thought she would work for a year, save some money, and then return to her dream later. But months turned into years, and life slowly moved in a different direction. The piano in her childhood home was eventually sold to help pay bills. Watching it leave the house was one of the hardest moments she had ever experienced. After that, music became something she carried only in her memory. The job at the restaurant came later. When she first walked into the building for the interview, she had been nervous. The place looked so polished and expensive compared to the simple life she had known before. But the manager saw that she was hardworking and polite, so he gave her a chance. At the beginning, the work felt overwhelming. The restaurant was always busy, and every detail mattered. Waitresses had to remember orders perfectly, move quickly between tables, and stay calm even when customers became impatient. Over time, she learned everything. She learned how to balance several plates on a tray. She learned how to read customers' moods and know when they needed something without even asking. She learned how to keep smiling, even on the most exhausting nights. Eventually, she became one of the most reliable members of the staff. Most guests only saw the calm and professional waitress who served their meals. They did not see the person she had been before. At the far side of the restaurant stood a beautiful grand piano. It was placed near a small stage area where live music was sometimes performed during special evenings. The instrument was shiny and elegant, its polished surface reflecting the warm lights of the room. Most nights, a hired pianist came to play soft background music while guests enjoyed their dinners. But on quieter evenings, the piano remained closed and silent. Every time she passed by it, she felt something inside her pause. Sometimes she slowed down just for a moment, glancing at the smooth black surface and the keys hidden beneath the lid. It reminded her of the life she had once imagined. She never told anyone about her past with music. To the other staff members, she was simply another coworker trying to make a living. On rare occasions when the restaurant was almost empty late at night, she would walk near the piano after finishing her shift. She never opened it, but she liked standing close enough to remember the feeling of sitting at the keys. Those quiet moments helped her reconnect with a part of herself that the world had nearly forgotten. But she always returned to reality quickly. There were tables to clean, dishes to carry, and another shift waiting the next day. Still, something about the piano never stopped calling to her. On one particular evening, the restaurant seemed even busier than usual. Expensive cars lined the street outside, and the dining room was filled with laughter and conversation. A group of wealthy guests had reserved several tables for a private celebration. The staff rushed around preparing everything perfectly. As she carried a tray of drinks across the room, she passed the grand piano once again. For a brief second, she looked at it the same way she always did. She had no idea that before the night ended, that silent piano would change everything. The restaurant became louder as the night moved forward. The private celebration had fully begun, and the atmosphere in the dining hall felt different from a normal evening. Expensive perfume mixed with the smell of freshly prepared food, and the sound of laughter echoed across the room. The group that had reserved the large tables near the center of the restaurant seemed to be enjoying themselves the most. They had arrived earlier than most guests, stepping out of luxury cars and walking inside with confident smiles. Many of them wore elegant suits and sparkling jewelry that caught the light as they moved. To them, this dinner was more than just a meal. It was a celebration of success. They talked loudly about business deals, investments, and travel plans. Every few minutes, someone raised a glass, making another toast. The staff knew that nights like this required extra attention. Guests who spent that much money expected everything to be perfect. She moved carefully between the tables, making sure everyone had what they needed. Her tray carried glasses filled with sparkling drinks, and she placed each one gently in front of the guests. Some people thanked her politely. Others barely looked up as they continued their conversations. That was something she had grown used to. Working in a place like this meant seeing many kinds of people. Some were kind and respectful. Others treated the staff like they were invisible. But she had learned not to take it personally. As she approached the large table again, the group was deep in conversation. One man was telling a loud story about a recent business deal. Everyone around him listened while he spoke with dramatic gestures. The others laughed and nodded as he described how successful the deal had been. While she poured another drink, she noticed a few people at the table looking around the restaurant, observing the decorations and the stage area. Near the corner of the room, the grand piano stood quietly under a soft spotlight. Its black surface reflected the warm glow of the lamps hanging above. Normally, a pianist would already be playing by this time, but tonight the stage was empty. One of the guests noticed it first. He leaned back in his chair and pointed toward the piano with a curious expression. "Is there supposed to be music tonight?" he asked one of the people sitting nearby. Another guest shrugged. "Probably," someone replied. "Places like this always have someone playing." The conversation moved on quickly, but a few eyes continued glancing toward the silent instrument. She returned to the table a few minutes later carrying another tray. As she carefully placed a dessert plate in front of one of the guests, she felt someone watching her. One of the men sitting at the end of the table was looking directly at her. His expression was not rude, but it carried the confident curiosity of someone who was used to being in control of every situation. "Excuse me," he said casually. She stopped and turned toward him with a polite smile. "Yes, sir?" He nodded toward the piano across the room. "Why is that piano sitting there all alone tonight?" She followed his gaze briefly. "The musician scheduled for tonight hasn't arrived yet," she explained calmly. "But I believe someone will be here soon." The man leaned back in his chair again. "That's strange," he said with a small laugh. "A fancy place like this should always have music." A few of the other guests nodded in agreement. Then his attention returned to her. "You were looking at the piano earlier," he said suddenly. The comment caught her by surprise. She had not realized anyone noticed that small moment when she passed by. For a second she hesitated before answering. "I just passed by it," she replied softly. But the man seemed curious now. "Do you play?" he asked. The question felt simple, yet it carried unexpected weight. For years she had avoided conversations like this. Music had become a quiet memory she kept to herself. Still, something about the moment made her answer honestly. "A little," she said. Several people at the table turned their heads toward her with interest. "A little?" one guest repeated with amusement. "Come on," another person said with a playful smile. "That means yes." The man who had first asked the question laughed lightly. "So we have a hidden musician in the restaurant." A few people chuckled at the idea. She remained calm, though she felt slightly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. "It's been a long time since I played," she explained. The conversation around the table grew more interested. One woman resting her elbow on the table tilted her head. "Well," she said, "if you can play even a little, that would be better than silence." The group laughed again. At first, the tone of the conversation felt harmless. They seemed more curious than anything else. But then someone spoke again with a teasing voice. "Why don't you play something for us?" the guest suggested. The idea spread quickly around the table. "Yes, that would be fun. Come on. Just one song. It would make the night more interesting." Their voices carried a mixture of amusement and challenge. To them, the suggestion probably felt like a simple joke to pass the time. But inside her, the request stirred something much deeper. Her eyes moved across the restaurant until they rested on the piano again. The instrument looked exactly the same as always. Quiet. Waiting. For a moment she imagined sitting there again, feeling the keys under her fingers. But then reality returned. She was not a pianist anymore. She was a waitress carrying a tray during a busy shift. She gave a polite shake of her head. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "I really haven't played in years." Some of the guests laughed again. "That makes it even better," someone joked. Another guest leaned forward with interest. "Don't worry," he said. "We're not expecting a concert." The man who had started the conversation smiled confidently. "Just one small piece," he said. "If it's terrible, we'll still applaud." More laughter spread around the table. Their tone was playful, but she could feel the pressure growing. Other diners nearby had started noticing the conversation. A few people glanced over with curiosity, wondering what was happening. She felt her heart beating a little faster. Part of her wanted to walk away and continue her work. But another part of her felt something she had not experienced in years. A quiet pull toward the piano. Before she could respond again, someone else approached the table. It was the restaurant manager. He had been watching from across the room after noticing the group pointing toward the stage. He looked slightly confused but polite. "Is everything all right here?" he asked. One of the guests spoke quickly. "We just discovered that your waitress can play the piano." The manager raised his eyebrows in surprise. He looked at her with curiosity. "Is that true?" She hesitated. "I used to play," she admitted quietly. The manager glanced toward the empty stage. The scheduled musician still had not arrived. For a moment he seemed to consider the situation carefully. Then the guest spoke again. "You should let her play something," one of them suggested. "It would be fun," another added. The manager looked uncertain. He knew the restaurant valued professionalism, and asking a waitress to perform was unusual. But the guests were clearly interested, and keeping important customers happy mattered. He turned back toward her. "You don't have to," he said in a calm voice. "But if you feel comfortable, maybe just one short piece." The room suddenly felt very quiet around her. She looked again toward the grand piano across the restaurant. For years she had only passed by it without touching the keys. Now everyone was watching her, waiting for an answer. She slowly took a breath. Somewhere deep inside, the memories of her childhood began to rise again. And for the first time in a very long time, the possibility of playing music no longer felt impossible. For a few seconds, she stood there without saying anything. The noise in the restaurant slowly returned as other guests continued their conversations. But around the large table, the attention remained on her. The manager waited patiently. The group of wealthy guests watched her with curious smiles, expecting some kind of response. Inside, her thoughts felt tangled. Part of her wanted to politely refuse and continue her work. That would be the safest choice. She had trays to carry, orders to remember, and a long shift still ahead of her. But another part of her felt something else, something she had not felt in many years. The quiet pull of music. Her eyes moved again toward the grand piano standing across the room. The soft light above it made the instrument look almost inviting. For years she had walked past it without touching it. Now everyone was waiting. "I really haven't played in a long time," she said again, her voice calm but uncertain. One of the guests lifted his glass and smiled. "That's all right," he said casually. "We're not judging. Just play something simple." Another guest laughed lightly. "Yes, something short. A minute or two." The comments were not cruel, but there was a playful tone behind them, as if they expected the moment to be entertaining. The manager leaned slightly closer to her and spoke in a quiet voice. "You don't have to do it," he reminded her. "Only if you want." She appreciated his words, but the room already felt filled with expectation. A few nearby diners had started watching as well. Some people whispered to each other, curious about what might happen next. For a moment she closed her eyes and took a slow breath. Images from the past began to return. She remembered sitting beside her father at the old piano in their small living room. She remembered the sound of his voice encouraging her to keep playing, even when the music became difficult. "You just have to trust your hands," he used to say. The memory brought both warmth and sadness. She opened her eyes again. Across the room, the piano waited quietly. Something inside her shifted. "All right," she said softly. The guests at the table leaned forward slightly. "I can try," she added. A small wave of excitement passed through the group. One of the guests clapped his hands once in approval. "There we go," he said with a grin. The manager looked a little surprised but gave a small nod. "If you need anything, just let me know," he said. She placed the empty tray onto a nearby service table and slowly walked toward the stage area. Each step felt heavier than the last. As she crossed the dining room, more people began noticing what was happening. Conversations faded slightly as curious eyes followed her movement. The grand piano seemed larger the closer she got. Its polished surface reflected the lights from above. The bench sat neatly in front of the keyboard, untouched. For a moment she simply stood there. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her from different parts of the room. Some people looked curious. Others looked amused. A few probably expected a quick mistake or an awkward moment. That thought made her hands feel slightly cold. She gently pulled the bench a little closer and sat down. The simple action felt strangely familiar. Her fingers rested on her lap as she looked at the piano keys in front of her. Black and white, perfectly arranged. For years she had imagined touching them again. But imagination and reality were very different things. She slowly lifted the piano lid. The soft sound of the movement echoed slightly in the quiet space around her. The keys were clean and smooth. For a moment she just stared at them. Her heart beat faster in her chest. What if I've forgotten? She wondered. It had been so long since she last played seriously. Life had been filled with work, responsibilities, and survival. Music had become something she carried quietly in her memory, not something she performed. Behind her, she could hear the guests at the large table whispering to each other. Someone chuckled softly. Another person said something she couldn't quite hear. She decided not to turn around. Instead, she focused on the piano. Her hands slowly lifted and hovered above the keys. The first touch felt strange. Her fingers pressed down gently on a single note. The sound floated softly into the room. Clear, bright. It felt like greeting an old friend after many years apart. She pressed another note, then another. The simple tones echoed through the quiet restaurant. A few people in the audience smiled politely, assuming this was just a small warm-up. But inside her, something deeper was happening. Her hands began remembering things her mind had almost forgotten. Muscle memory slowly returned. The patterns she had practiced thousands of times as a child started rising from somewhere deep inside her. She placed both hands on the keys. For a moment she paused again. Then she began playing. The first notes formed a soft melody. It was gentle and slow, almost like a quiet conversation between the piano and the room. Some guests continued eating, expecting background music. But the melody began to grow stronger. Her fingers moved carefully at first, still testing their confidence. Then something changed. The music started flowing more naturally. The rhythm became smoother. The notes connected beautifully, one after another. She stopped thinking about the people watching her. She stopped worrying about mistakes. Instead, she focused only on the music. Her shoulders relaxed. Her hands moved faster now, dancing across the keys with growing confidence. At the large table, the group that had challenged her slowly stopped talking. One guest leaned forward. Another turned his chair slightly toward the stage. The playful smiles on their faces began to fade, replaced by curiosity. The melody grew richer. Soft notes rose into the air and gently filled the room. Even the waiters moving between tables slowed their steps, glancing toward the piano. A woman at a nearby table lowered her fork and listened quietly. Someone near the back of the restaurant whispered, "Is that the waitress playing?" But she didn't hear any of those reactions. Her world had become the piano. Years of emotion seemed to pour into every note. Memories of childhood. Memories of her father listening proudly beside her. Memories of dreams that once felt possible. The music carried all of it. What began as a small challenge was turning into something no one expected. And the restaurant, which had been filled with noise and laughter only minutes earlier, was slowly becoming quieter with every passing note. The melody continued flowing through the restaurant, and something about it felt different from the usual background music people heard during dinner. At first, a few guests thought it was simply a pleasant tune played by someone who knew the basics. But as the music grew deeper and more expressive, people began realizing that what they were hearing was far from ordinary. The waitress sitting at the piano had stopped looking nervous. Her shoulders were relaxed now, and her fingers moved across the keys with confidence. Every note felt placed with care, like she was telling a story without using words. At the large table where the idea had started, the group of wealthy guests had become completely quiet. Earlier, they had been laughing and talking loudly about business deals and travel plans. Now their attention was fixed on the stage. One of them slowly lowered his glass onto the table without taking his eyes off the piano. Another guest leaned back in his chair, his expression slowly changing from amusement to surprise. No one had expected this. The melody began softly, almost like a whisper, but it was growing stronger with each passing moment. Her hands moved smoothly from one section of the keyboard to another, shifting between gentle notes and richer chords. The sound filled the entire room. Even the kitchen staff near the doorway paused for a moment to listen. At a nearby table, a couple who had been in the middle of a quiet conversation stopped speaking. The woman tilted her head slightly, listening more carefully. "Who is playing?" she whispered. Her companion shrugged, but he looked just as curious. Across the restaurant, several people had already taken out their phones. Some of them were recording the moment without fully understanding why it felt so special. The music carried a feeling that was difficult to explain. It was not loud or dramatic like a performance in a concert hall. Instead, it felt personal, honest, the kind of music that made people stop and feel something inside. At the piano, she had forgotten about the room again. Her mind had returned to the place where music always lived inside her. The keys beneath her fingers felt familiar now, like they had never been gone. The long years away from the piano seemed to disappear with each passing note. Her hands moved naturally, guided by instinct and memory. For a brief moment, she could almost imagine that she was back in her childhood home. She remembered the old upright piano in the living room. She remembered the quiet evenings when her father would sit nearby, listening patiently as she practiced. Sometimes he would close his eyes while she played. Sometimes he would smile and say, "Play that part again." The memory warmed her heart even as she continued playing. The melody began shifting into a more powerful section. Her fingers moved faster across the keyboard, building a rhythm that lifted the energy of the music. The soft notes from earlier blended into something fuller and more emotional. People in the restaurant felt the change immediately. The room grew even quieter. At the large table, the man who had first asked her about the piano slowly leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. His confident smile from earlier was gone now. Instead, he looked thoughtful. The playful challenge he had given her had turned into something he hadn't expected. One of the other guests whispered quietly, "She's really good." Another nodded slowly. "Yes. Much better than I thought." Their earlier laughter now felt distant and slightly embarrassing. Across the dining room, the manager stood near the entrance, watching the performance with wide eyes. When he had agreed to let her try playing a short piece, he had expected something simple and brief. But this was something else entirely. He had worked in restaurants for many years and had heard many musicians perform on that very stage. Yet there was something about this moment that felt different. Maybe it was the surprise, or maybe it was the feeling behind the music. At the piano, she continued playing without noticing any of this. Her focus remained completely on the melody. Her hands moved between delicate high notes and deeper chords, creating waves of sound that filled the room with warmth. Each note carried emotion, not just skill but feeling. Some diners closed their eyes for a moment while listening. Others simply watched in silence. The elegant restaurant that had once been full of loud conversations now felt almost like a small concert hall. Even the clinking of silverware had stopped. At one table near the window, an older man quietly wiped his glasses while listening. At another table, a young woman held her phone steady, recording every second. The music seemed to slow down for a moment, becoming softer again. It felt like a quiet breath between two parts of a story. Her fingers moved gently across the keys, almost floating. Then, slowly, the melody began rising again. The rhythm grew stronger. The notes became brighter and more powerful. It was as if all the emotions she had carried over the years were finally finding their way into the music. The sadness of lost dreams, the warmth of childhood memories, the strength she had built while facing difficult times. All of it blended together in the sound of the piano. People listening could feel it, even if they didn't know her story. At the large table, the guests now looked completely absorbed in the performance. No one spoke anymore. One guest quietly shook his head in disbelief. Another guest leaned closer and whispered, "She's not just playing. She's performing." The man who had started the whole moment slowly exhaled. He hadn't expected to feel humbled by a simple suggestion. Yet here he was, listening with genuine admiration. The melody reached its final section. Her hands moved with confidence now, gliding across the keyboard as if the piano had always belonged to her. The notes climbed higher and higher before gently slowing down again. The music softened, becoming delicate once more. One final sequence of notes flowed through the room like a quiet goodbye. Her fingers pressed the last chord. The sound echoed softly into the silence. Then everything stopped. Her hands rested on the keys for a brief moment before she slowly lifted them. The restaurant remained completely still. No one moved. No one spoke. For several seconds, the entire room stayed silent, as if everyone needed time to process what they had just experienced. The same people who had once laughed and joked about the idea of a waitress playing the piano now sat frozen in their chairs. The performance had left them speechless. The final chord faded slowly into the quiet restaurant, and for a few long seconds, no one moved. The sound seemed to hang in the air, like the room itself was holding its breath. She kept her hands resting lightly above the piano keys, unsure of what to do next. Her heart was beating fast, but her mind felt strangely calm. She had simply played. For a moment she wondered if she had done something wrong. The silence in the room felt so deep that it almost made her nervous again. Then a chair moved somewhere in the dining hall. The small sound broke the stillness. A second later, someone began clapping. It was slow at first, just a few claps from a table near the window. Then another person joined. Within seconds, the quiet room filled with applause. The sound grew louder and louder as more guests stood up from their seats, clapping with genuine excitement. Some people even whistled softly in appreciation. The applause spread across the entire restaurant until it felt like the whole room was celebrating. She turned slightly on the piano bench, surprised by the reaction. She had expected polite clapping, maybe a few smiles. But this was different. People were standing now. Several guests raised their phones again, still recording. At the large table where everything had started, the group of wealthy guests were also clapping. But their expressions were no longer playful or amused. They looked impressed, even a little stunned. The man who had first asked her about the piano slowly stood up from his chair while clapping. He shook his head slightly, as if he was still trying to understand what had just happened. That was... One of the guests near him said quietly, "Not what I expected." Another guest laughed softly. "Not even close." At the piano, she slowly stood from the bench. Her legs felt a little shaky, but she kept a calm smile on her face. The applause continued as she gave a small, polite nod toward the room. She wasn't used to this kind of attention anymore. Years ago, performing had been part of her life, but those days felt far away now. Still, hearing people appreciate the music again warmed her heart in a way she hadn't expected. Across the room, the restaurant manager walked toward the stage area with a wide smile. He had been watching the entire performance from the entrance, and even he looked amazed. When he reached the piano, he leaned slightly closer and spoke quietly so only she could hear. "I had no idea," he said. She gave a small, modest smile. "It's been a long time," she replied softly. "Well," the manager said with a short laugh, "I think everyone here is very glad you decided to play tonight." The applause slowly began to settle as guests returned to their seats, but the energy in the room had completely changed. Instead of loud conversations and business talk, people now spoke about the performance they had just witnessed. At one table, a couple was replaying the video they had recorded. "Listen to that part again," the woman said, pointing at the phone screen. Her companion nodded in agreement. "That was incredible." At another table, someone said, "I thought she was just going to play a simple tune." "So did I," another guest replied. "But that was something else." Meanwhile, at the large table near the center of the room, the group of wealthy guests continued discussing the moment. The man who had started the conversation earlier placed his hands in his pockets and slowly walked toward the piano. His expression looked thoughtful now. When he reached her, the rest of the room grew slightly quieter again, curious about what he might say. For a brief second, he simply looked at the piano. Then he looked at her. "I owe you an apology," he said calmly. She seemed surprised by his words. "For what?" she asked. He gave a small smile. "When I suggested you play, I thought it would just be a little joke for the evening. He shook his head again. I didn't expect that. A few guests nearby chuckled quietly. He continued speaking. That was one of the most beautiful performances I've heard in a long time. His voice sounded sincere now. The playful tone from earlier had completely disappeared. She nodded politely. Thank you, she said. One of the other guests from the table joined them. Where did you learn to play like that? The guest asked with curiosity. She hesitated for a moment. I used to practice a lot when I was younger, she explained simply. The guests exchanged glances. That explains the skill, one of them said. Another guest smiled. You should be performing somewhere bigger than a restaurant. She didn't know how to respond to that. For years she had tried not to think about what might have been if life had taken a different path. The manager cleared his throat gently. Well, he said with a proud smile. It seems our restaurant has a hidden talent. Several guests nearby laughed warmly. One of them lifted a glass toward her. To the pianist, he said. A few other diners raised their glasses as well. She felt slightly embarrassed by the attention but grateful at the same time. The atmosphere in the restaurant slowly returned to normal, but the mood remained different now. The earlier arrogance and loud conversations had softened. Many guests continued talking about the performance. Some even approached the piano area briefly to compliment her before returning to their tables. Meanwhile, the staff members working in the restaurant looked at her with new expressions. Some of them smiled with surprise. One waiter whispered quietly as he passed by, I didn't know you could play like that. She laughed softly. I guess I never mentioned it. In the kitchen doorway, another staff member shook his head with admiration. That was amazing, he said. She thanked him before returning to her work. The evening continued, but something important had shifted. The same people who had once seen her as just another waitress now looked at her with respect and curiosity. And although she returned to carrying trays and serving tables, the music from that piano still seemed to echo gently through the room. None of them knew yet that the moment they had witnessed was only the beginning of a much bigger change. After the applause slowly faded and the excitement in the restaurant settled, the evening continued, but nothing felt quite the same. Guests returned to their conversations and meals, yet the earlier noise and arrogance had softened. The atmosphere felt warmer, almost thoughtful. She stepped away from the piano and quietly returned to her duties. There were still tables waiting to be served, drinks to refill and plates to clear. For a moment, it almost felt strange to carry trays again after sitting at the piano. But she moved through the restaurant the same way she always had, calm, polite, and focused on her work. A few guests stopped her as she passed by. One woman gently touched her arm and said, Your music was beautiful. Another guest smiled and added, You made the whole room quiet. That doesn't happen often. Each compliment made her feel both grateful and a little shy. She simply thanked them and continued working. At the large table near the center of the room, the group of wealthy guests looked very different now compared to earlier in the night. The loud laughter and confident bragging had faded. They spoke more quietly, occasionally glancing toward her as she walked past. The man who had first asked her about the piano remained thoughtful for the rest of the evening. Once or twice he looked toward the stage where the grand piano stood. It no longer looked like a simple decoration. It had become the center of a moment none of them would forget. Later that night, when most of the guests had finished their meals, a few people walked toward the stage again. Some of them asked if she would play another piece. She smiled politely but explained that she needed to finish her shift. Most people understood, though they seemed slightly disappointed. The restaurant slowly emptied as the evening came to an end. Luxury cars pulled away from the entrance one by one, carrying guests back to their homes. Inside, the staff began cleaning the dining room and preparing to close for the night. The manager approached her near the service counter with a warm expression. I think tonight was one of the most unusual evenings we've had here, he said with a quiet laugh. She nodded slightly. It surprised me too, she replied. He folded his arms and looked toward the piano across the room. You know, he continued, we've hired many musicians over the years, but the way people reacted tonight, that was something special. She didn't know how to respond to that. For a long time she had tried not to think about music as something important in her life anymore. It had become a memory she kept quietly in her heart. But tonight had changed something. The manager spoke again. If you ever feel like playing again during quieter nights, I'm sure our guests would enjoy it. She looked at him with surprise. You mean here? She asked. He nodded. Of course. Only if you want to. The idea felt both exciting and strange. She thanked him for the offer before returning to help the other staff finish cleaning. Later that night, after the restaurant had officially closed, she walked toward the stage once more. The lights were dim now, and the room felt peaceful. The grand piano stood quietly under the soft glow of a single lamp. For a moment she simply stood there, remembering the performance from earlier. It still felt almost unreal. She gently touched the edge of the piano with her fingers. Years ago, music had been her entire world. Then life had taken her in a different direction. She had believed that part of her life was gone forever. But tonight had shown her something important. Some dreams never completely disappear. They simply wait. A soft sound interrupted her thoughts. One of the waiters approached with a smile. Still thinking about the performance? He asked. She laughed quietly. A little. He shook his head with admiration. I recorded a part of it on my phone, he said. People online are going to love it. She looked surprised. You recorded it? Just a short clip, he replied. Several guests were recording too. She hadn't thought about that. To her, the performance had been a personal moment, something between her and the piano. But to the people in the room it had been something worth sharing. The next morning, she woke up and prepared for another normal day. She didn't expect anything unusual. But when she arrived at the restaurant that afternoon, the atmosphere felt slightly different. A few staff members greeted her with curious smiles. Looks like you're becoming famous, one of them joked. She looked confused. What do you mean? Another coworker held up a phone. The screen showed a video from the previous night. It was the moment she had been sitting at the piano, playing while the restaurant quietly listened. The clip had already been shared many times online. Comments appeared below the video, praising the performance. People wrote things like, "That's incredible," and "Where's this restaurant?" Some viewers were amazed that a waitress had played with such skill. Others simply enjoyed the music. She stared at the phone in surprise. I didn't expect that, she admitted. Her coworker laughed. Well, the internet loves unexpected moments. The manager walked by and noticed the conversation. He smiled. I guess the secret is out, he said. She felt a mix of emotions. Part of her felt shy about the sudden attention. But another part of her felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Over the next few days, more people came to the restaurant after seeing the video. Some of them asked the staff about the waitress who had played the piano. A few guests even requested to sit near the stage. The manager eventually approached her again with a thoughtful expression. I've been thinking, he said. She looked at him curiously. About what? He nodded toward the piano. How would you feel about playing again this weekend? She hesitated. The idea felt both exciting and slightly scary. But she remembered the feeling of sitting at the piano that night. The music, the quiet room, the connection with the audience. Slowly, she smiled. I think I would like that, she said. The manager nodded with satisfaction. As she walked past the piano later that evening, she glanced at it the same way she had many times before. But this time the feeling was different. The instrument no longer reminded her of something she had lost. Instead, it felt like a door that had quietly opened again. The night when a group of wealthy guests had jokingly asked a waitress to play the piano had turned into something no one expected. It had reminded everyone in that restaurant of an important truth. Talent can appear in the most unexpected places. And sometimes all it takes is one moment, one song for the world to finally notice.